So today we have someone who is extraordinary in being able to do that kind of comparison in areas that most people would think were very disparate. It occurred to me that it would be interesting way back when I was planning this year's series of lectures, to have someone who could do a comparison of ancient Greek and ancient Chinese culture. So I stuck in my search engine, ancient Greek and ancient Chinese culture, being ready to be totally disappointed, and yet came up a winner. That winner, I hope you'll think it's a winner, that winner was Dr. Alexander Beecroft, who is, I had it on my screen, and the thing about this is the screen goes blank. He is the Jessie, Chapman, Alcorn Memorial Professor of Literature, or is it comparable?
Foreign languages.
Foreign languages at the University of South Carolina. He's the author of 3 books at this stage. The last to appear, and you can get a sense of this gentleman's intellectual ambition just by the title, was An Ecology of Verb Literature, which I read with great profit prior to his coming, and he's working on a book which should appear in about 2 years' time, which will be called A History of Global Literature. Can you imagine actually doing that? But after having spent the day with him, I'm sure he will succeed admirably. So today his topic is a comparison of Chinese and Greek, ancient Chinese and Greek poetry. Before I turn the mic over to him, let me say that we have 2 events remaining. Actually, we have a week-long series of events during the first week of April, all centered on Shakespeare and his legacy. And it will feature a lecture by the very distinguished Shakespearean Dr. Paul Cantor of the University of Virginia on Thursday, April 5th. And then on April 19th, which I believe is also a Thursday, we will have another University of Virginia senior faculty member, Dr. James Caesar. He should be a classicist, of course, but he's actually a political scientist. He will be talking about Madison as the framer's framer. So we'll find out more about James Madison. But having given an introduction that I'm sure will whet your appetite, or has whet your appetite for what will follow, let's give a hand and the mic to Dr. Beecroft.
Well, thank you very much to the Institute and to Dr. Balch for that very generous introduction and for bringing me here today. I am very happy to be speaking to you about this subject. I too am a very strong believer that if we want to think about what any culture is or is like, it's most helpful to do so, at least in part, by thinking about other cultures and thinking about the two in comparison and thinking about similarities and differences. And this is in fact actually part of my first book project, the one that sort of began with a dissertation many, many years ago on authorship in early Greece and China, where I was interested in a particular phenomenon. I should just advance the slide there. A particular phenomenon, or a particular problem, you might say, that both Greece and China faced in what we would say is the Hellenistic period and onwards in Greece and in imperial China from the Han Dynasty onwards, the problem of how to interpret, make sense, contextualize ancient poetic texts. Right? And so, to give you the short version of that argument so you don't have to read the book right now, although I encourage you, available in better bookstores everywhere, or not really, but I encourage you to think about these questions anyway. The argument of the book, in Greece in this period, what we do is we develop the idea of the author. Right? We develop a biography of the poet, often kind of reading out from the poetry events that might fit into a poet's life, but we also use biographies of poets as a way of thinking through what poetry means, how it works, how it's created, how it circulates. In China, in this very earliest period, that's not really what happens. And the earliest Chinese poetry, which is what the bulk of this talk will be about, doesn't really feature authors at all. It's an anthology of poetry, and I'll talk more about the details in just a minute, where almost none of the poems have named authors. And in fact, even when poems themselves happen to name an author internally to the poem, the commentary and interpretation history of the poem is rarely about that attribution. And so we'll see what the Chinese tradition does instead as a way of contextualizing these poems as we come to them. So for most of the talk, I'm going to talk about this particular ancient Chinese anthology of poetry, the canon of songs, the Shijing. Later on, I'll talk very briefly about the later Chinese tradition, just to kind of highlight that what I'm talking about most of the time is an earlier phenomenon. And then at the end, I'm going to turn to the Greek lyric tradition very briefly as well, and think about how maybe some of the things I've said about China might help us understand Greek poetry as well. So that's a brief overview. I just wanted to start with my opening slide too, as this is a nice sort of physical reminder of the materiality of poetry in both of these places and the precariousness of its survival in both places. Right? We have a papyrus with some Greek poetry on it there, and we see the problems very vividly there, I think, of transmission through a medium like this. On the right, we have one of the principal media in which Chinese texts of the ancient period were transmitted, and that's on strips of bamboo, very thin strips of bamboo, and you could write one character down vertically. You can see they survive pretty well. They survive better than something like papyrus. But what doesn't survive as well are the threads that link all of these strips together. So there's a whole sort of sub-discipline of early China studies that's about comparing the hole marks on the sides of those bamboo strips to try to figure out which ones were attached to which, so you could put the text back in order after thousands of years. All right, so slightly different challenges faced in trying to interpret or deal with the two kinds of text there, but both face these similar philological epigraphical challenges that I think are really kind of interesting in their own right. But first, let's talk about the canon of songs, the Shijing. Shijing just being the Chinese name, and I'll call it the canon of songs in English for want of a better name. It's a collection of poems of about 300 poems that survive. Traditionally, the Chinese would say that these poems were composed somewhere between about 1000 BC, basically from the beginning of the Zhou dynasty in the 11th century BC, through to about 600 BC, which, if true, would make these poems roughly comparable in age to Homer and to archaic lyric in the Greek tradition, right? Traditionally, we're told this collection was edited by Confucius. And so the story is that there were originally 3,000 poems that were transmitted. Confucius reviewed the 3,000 poems. He got rid of the bad ones. He got rid of the duplicates, narrowed it down to a collection of 300 poems that conveyed the values he wanted conveyed in poetry. And that became one of the 13 Confucian classics, eventually originally one of the 5 Confucian classics, a very key text, either way you think about it, to the Chinese tradition from the earliest possible stages. That collection is then divided into 4 sections traditionally. The first section, the Guothong, or the Airs of the States, is a collection of very short lyric poems that are organized according to the regional states into which China was divided in this period. So for most of this time, China, like Greece, was divided into a series of small city-states that were constantly at war with each other. And there's a small collection of sort of 10 to 20 poems from many of these states in the Shijing, in the canon of songs. So that's the Airs of the States. Then the Xiaoya and the Daya, the minor court songs and the greater court songs. Minor court songs are, for the most part, songs that in fact might have been performed at court, songs that might have had an entertainment value sometimes, which also sometimes deal with kind of civic or ceremonial events. And the major court songs are a similar and overlapping collection, but that differ partly in length, but mostly in that they tend, at least some of them, to contain very explicit historical narratives. So we have a few of these major court songs that will describe battles that were fought, specific named battles that the Zhou fought against its northern enemies, and other aspects of Zhou history, including a kind of mythical formation story for the dynasty that involves a legendary queen swallowing an egg and becoming pregnant, and so on. So kind of back to the mythical origins of the dynasty. And then finally, at the end, we have a short collection called the Song, or the Temple Hymns, and these are hymns of ancestor worship. So that's, as I say, the traditional model of thinking about this text, traditionally 1600 BC, and then edited by Confucius. That's almost all probably wrong, everything I just put on that previous slide, or at least not accurate about the earliest history of these poems. So archaeology is making incredibly rapid strides in China after a very complicated 20th century in China, obviously, which meant that until about 1980, it was very difficult to do rigorous archaeological work in many places. Since that time, our knowledge of the early period has exploded in China. We have all sorts of manuscripts and texts that we didn't have before, and we also have a lot of material objects, including bronzes on which texts are written. And these are often datable, and so we can see by comparing the texts on these inscriptions that we've recently uncovered and these poems, that these poems are probably newer in date than some of the inscriptions, and so probably the earliest poems date to maybe 800 BC rather than the 1000 BC that they were originally thought to be. And that they're not therefore from the very beginning of the Zhou dynasty, but from a slightly later period looking back on the earlier period of the dynasty. So there's that. But then these poems were not originally a collection of poems, right? There's a difference between there being a whole bunch of poems floating out there in a culture and having a coherent anthology with a fixed canon of poems arranged in a fixed order. And that comes very late, we think now. So we have the first reference to anything that might be a collection of poems in about the 4th century BC. But it's very difficult to actually be sure, even then, because of a feature of the way the classical Chinese language works. So we have this expression here, shi yue, which you can translate as the poem says, or as there is a poem that says, or as the poems, as a title, say. There's no way of distinguishing between singular and plural, no way of distinguishing between a title and simply the word poem. And so often in ancient texts, one of these poems will be quoted, and they'll be quoted with that phrase, shi yue, the poem says. And we don't know, are they referring to the anthology that already exists, or just to an individual poem? So it's very, very difficult to date the whole anthology. We do have a manuscript recently discovered in a tomb called Confucius's Discussion of the Songs that probably dates to about 300 BC. And this manuscript does have Confucius as a character discussing several of these poems, offering very different interpretations, in fact, from the received tradition, which is itself interesting. And this is probably the clearest early reference to Confucius being associated with the poems. So he may not really have been associated with the arrangement of this anthology until about 300 BC. What we know about Confucius before that period is itself very shaky, and that's another topic for another day. But basically it seems like somewhere around 150 BC is when we begin to see something like this anthology appearing in this order with these poems and only these poems, and with a relatively fixed text. So the anthology probably comes from a much later period than tradition says it does, and yet it's still obviously one of the earliest collections of poetry in the Chinese tradition, the very earliest poems written that survive to this day, and has always been immensely important to the Chinese literary tradition. This has always been and will always be the beginning of Chinese poetry. And so I'm going to begin with the beginning, with the first of the poems in this collection, just to give you a feel partly for the poems of the heirs of the states, of that first out of the 4 sections of the collection. This is my translation, not a very good translation in some ways, but hopefully it will do. Guan guan cry the ospreys on the banks of the river. The chaste, virtuous girl is a good match for the gentleman. The amaranth grows irregularly. To the left and right it drifts. The chaste, virtuous girl, asleep and awake, I seek her. I seek and do not get her. Asleep and awake, I think of her. Alas, alas, I toss and turn on back and side. The amaranth grows irregularly. To the left and right we gather it. The chaste, virtuous girl, I befriend her with lute and zither. The amaranth grows irregularly. To the left and right we pick it. The chaste, virtuous girl, with bell and drum I delight her. And so that's the poem. And so I kind of invite you, now that you've seen the poem, now that I've read it, I invite you to think a little bit about what you would think this poem means, right? Without access to an entire tradition of commentary that goes on for thousands of years, and without kind of an access to the culture that created the poem, just reading my translation, which is designed to convey this effect as much as anything, I think you'll get the sense, right, that this is a poem that feels like it's a poem about a young man in love. Right, that feels like it's a poem about a man who desires this woman, who chases after her, who has sleepless nights over her, who offers her presents or entertains her with musical instruments, and finally, at the end of the poem, seems to achieve some kind of success with her. Right, that seems to be the story of the poem. But you'll also be left wondering a little bit, if you're the average Western reader, I think, why there are ospreys crying at the beginning of the poem, why people are gathering amaranth, or whatever the grain actually is in the poem, why we're on the banks of the river. All of these things may seem a little bit mysterious, right? This doesn't quite add up to a poem as we would expect it in certain ways. And so I'll be coming back to this poem a couple of times in the talk to help make sense of that, but I wanted to begin just with offering you the poem itself. To give a feel for the minor chord songs, I put up this one, Gathering Thorn Ferns. I'm not going to, I think, read all of this out loud because it's a longer poem. It goes on to the next slide. But the gist of the poem you can see from reading just bits of it. So the first stanza, let us gather the thorn ferns, let us gather the thorn ferns. The thorn ferns are now springing up. When shall we return? When shall we return? It will be late in the next year. Wife and husband will be separated because of the Xian Yun. We shall have no leisure to rest because of the Xian Yun. So it's a poem, obviously, about going to war, right? About men going off to war. There's a sense clearly about families being separated by war, about wives being sorrowful about being left behind, or husbands worrying about their wives being left behind. There's definitely that sort of familial concern. As we go through the poem, and I won't, as I say, read the whole thing out loud just for reasons of time, but as you go through the whole poem, it's definitely a poem that seems to express doubts about this particular war, too, and how well it's actually going, how likely the Ijou are to win the war, what the consequences are likely to be. And so I'll just speed along to the final stanza, which I think reinforces those themes pretty clearly. At first, when we set out, the willows were fresh and green. Now, when we shall be returning, the snow will be falling in clouds. Long and tedious will be our marching. We shall hunger, we shall thirst. Our hearts are wounded with grief, and no one knows our sadness. That's at the end of the poem. And again, as you read that poem, as a 21st century North American reader, I think it's hard to read that poem and not see it as a poem that is in some way sad about this war, right? That is talking about the pain and the suffering and the sadness that this war against the Xian Yun, against the northern tribe, is causing to the soldiers who are fighting and to their wives back home. It's actually not how the tradition interprets it. We can come back to that in a minute, because it's kind of an interesting reason why the tradition interprets this very differently. And then finally, here's one of the temple hymns. And this is the whole poem. You can see these are often shorter. You can see it has a sort of irregular structure. I've laid it out in the Chinese there just to reinforce that instead of couplets, it's like 2 couplets and then 3 lines at the end. In this section, we often have these kind of irregular things. This part of the collection is the most archaic in language, or maybe the most archaicizing, we don't know for sure. And the poems are both very difficult to read because they're archaic in their style, and they're very kind of straightforwardly ritual hymns. They're things that were performed probably while rituals were being carried out. So in this case, oh great, this is a poem called King Wu, actually not King Wen. Oh great you are, King Wu. Nothing is strong but in your efforts. Truly Wen is King Wen. I didn't translate Wen there because it's a very problematic word. It can mean literate, civilized. It can mean, perhaps in this case, just the legitimate heir to his father. Able to open the way for his heirs. Wu, the inheritor, received this defeating and exterminating Yin. You brought about and established your merit. Easy enough to see in this case, I think. This is a poem that celebrates a king, entirely appropriate for a ritual of sacrifice to the ancestors, right, to this particular king. And so this is a poem you would have to say is a political poem, right, on some kind of level. It's a religious poem, but it's also a poem about the established dynasty, about the greatness of a particular king. It would be impossible to read this poem outside of a political context. Similarly with that last poem about war, right, it is about a specific war. It names the enemy. And so it should be, at least in principle, possible to interpret that poem, to locate it precisely in history at a specific moment, and to kind of think about how the actual historical events of that war may be having an impact on the poem itself. But if you go back to the first poem I read, Guan Cry the Ospreys, that poem was extremely difficult to situate in any kind of historical way, right? There are no clues within the poem as to when or where it is set. It just seems to be about this young man in love, and to that extent it could be anywhere, anytime. Right? Certainly within a cultural world like early China, it could be anywhere, anytime. So this is sort of the dilemma that the Confucian tradition faced when it took this body of text, these poems, and decided to make them into an anthology that conveyed Confucian values. Some of the poems very clearly do that, some of them don't seem to do that at all. And so how do you balance that out, and how do you come up with a way of understanding and interpreting these poems that makes sense from a political, ethical perspective, even though some of them seem like they have nothing to do with those questions at all? And so the answer that comes up around 150 BC, when this anthology comes together, is expressed in the first major text of Chinese poetic theory, the Mao preface to the Canon of Songs. The Mao there is the same character, the same family name as Mao Zedong, the later ruler, but of course this is a very different time in Chinese history. And so I'll read some of this out loud because it's kind of important. Song is where the will moves to. In the mind, it's will. When it comes out in language, it is song. Feelings move within and take shape in language. When language is not enough, then we sigh and moan. When that is not enough, then we sing and chant. When that is not enough, then unconsciously hands and feet gesture and dance. When feelings take shape in sound and that sound takes shape in words, we call it music. And so this is kind of the basic idea that the Confucian tradition will develop about what poetry is and why it matters, is that poetry is this kind of spontaneous expression of emotion. If you've read Wordsworth's preface to the lyrical ballads, you'll find very similar sentiments in some way in there, which is kind of interesting. But there's very much the stylized idea here too, right? So you have these burgeoning emotions inside you, you can't keep them in anymore, so you start to sigh, then you start to speak, and then you start to sing and dance, and it all kind of comes out of you. And if it does so in a structured way, that's a poem, that's a song. All right? And then we see this kind of builds in from that individual level to a social level in the next paragraph. So the music of a well-governed age is peaceful and happy. Its government harmonious. The music of a disordered age is angry and resentful. Its government decayed. The music of a lost state is sad and pensive. Its people are in difficulty. Therefore, in regulating profit and loss, moving heaven and earth, swaying ghosts and gods, nothing approaches song. So song is the best way, poetry is the best way of doing all of these things. And that's because there's this kind of one-to-one relationship between the kind of poetry and song that people produce and the state of their times. In happy times, people produce happy, pleasant songs. In sad times, they produce disharmonious, unpleasant songs. And so you can both detect how well things are going by listening to the songs people are singing, and you can try to shape how people perceive their time through producing and disseminating songs that do the right thing, right? So it's kind of an interesting dualism there. Kings of old used song to regulate husband and wife, to bring about filial piety and respect, to enrich human relations, to beautify education, to change popular customs. So song can do all of these things. Kind of different from the Platonic mimetic idea of, what literature might be about. There's a section here, which I'm just sort of noting for the moment, we'll come back to briefly, that song has 6 forms, we're told. 3 of them are the names of the 3 sections of the collection: the airs, the court songs, large and small, and the hymns. The other 3, narration, comparison, and affective image, I'm going to come back to in a minute. But these 6 seem to be structures for how to think about what poetry does or how it does it. Right? And as I say, 3 of them are the organizing categories of the anthology. The other 3 are something more like tropes. And these airs, the airs of the states, the word air there is really wind, literally in Chinese. The idea is that the wind blows across the grasses and shapes the world that it blows over in the same kind of way that song shapes people's minds, right, by blowing over them. And then we get this really interesting passage in a way which suggests that for every kind of song that you might have, every one of these forms, you have both orthodox and deviant versions, straight and crooked, literally. And so there are straight versions of these songs where happy people in happy times sing praise of their rulers, for example. And then there are the deviant, the crooked versions where times are not so good. People cannot praise their rulers, so they don't. But they don't directly criticize the ruler either, because of course that's dangerous. So what they do, especially dangerous in bad times, right? In bad times you have bad rulers who are especially likely to punish you for standing up against them. So what you do is you sing praise, for example, of earlier rulers. And by celebrating the greatness of an earlier king, you remind the current king tactfully of how far he falls short of that earlier model, and hopefully correct him and persuade him that he should become more like his predecessors. Right? So the deviant airs come from feelings and reach only to the rights and principles. That they come from feelings is the nature of the people. That they reach only to rights and principles is the influence of the former kings. And so you can use this structure of praise and then of kind of indirect blame through praising someone else as a way of offering your opinions about the state of politics or the state of the world in your time. But it's also a way that you can then interpret poems, and that'll become crucial. So as this anthology of poems gets put together, as the collection, for example, is arranged so that the earlier part, the Airs of the States, is split up into poems by different states, one of the things you can do is to decide that the poems are created or arranged in a chronological order, going from good times, therefore, to bad, because history is always moving towards the end of the dynasty in a kind of state of decline. And therefore, you can interpret each of the poems on that basis. You know because of how the poem is situated within the collection, whether it's praise for an existing ruler who's good, or blame for a bad ruler through that form of indirect praise. And so that provides this kind of framework for interpreting even the most unpromising of poems as deeply political, as deeply politically engaged commentaries on their time. And again, and here, this is also important. So back to that narration, comparison, and affective image, right? Those categories I mentioned earlier. So in a way, we think of sort of literal and metaphorical meaning, perhaps, in English and in the Western tradition. We think of something in a poem might either mean literally what it says it means, or it might be a symbol for something else. The early Chinese tradition thinks of a tripartite division here, 3 options rather than 2. So an image in a poem might be it might be narration. It might be just describing what's really actually there at the scene of the poem. It might be B, comparison, in which case it's not there at the scene of the poem itself, but it's a simile, right? It's something that is like the stuff that is happening in the poem, and it helps us to understand what's happening in the poem. Or, door number 3, it might be a sing, an affective image, and that's something that just evokes the mood of the situation of the poem, not in a direct one-to-one way like simile does, but in a kind of vaguer, more affective way, right? So it just feels sad because you feel sad, that kind of thing. And so you get this is a way then of thinking about the opening of that first poem. Guan guan cry the ospreys on the banks of the river, the chaste virtuous girl is a good match for the gentleman. If you want to understand what the ospreys are doing there, you can think of it in one of these 3 ways. Maybe the man who's lovesick is walking down the streets, or walking down the riverbank in this case, feeling sad about not having been able to speak to this woman he loves, and as he walks along the riverbank, he hears ospreys cry in the distance. And it's a melancholy cry or whatever, but it's actually happening. And his poem is just straightforwardly describing someone along the riverbank hearing ospreys cry. That would be B, narration, or comparison would mean, okay, so there are no actual ospreys involved in the making of this poem, but what is happening is that the ospreys represent something in some straightforward one-to-one way. The ospreys are a symbol of something. And then xing, the affective image, would mean, again, like maybe that's just that the sad cry of the osprey is suggestive of the sorrow of this man. Not a literal, physically present osprey, nor a metaphor in a very precise way, but more just an evocation of the melancholy of the scene. And so that range of options also allows you to be very creative in how you understand what's going on in any particular poem, because any particular image can either be physically present at the scene of the poem or existing on one of these other levels. And it's important to remember that a lot of these poems are deeply political. Here's another of the hymns. King Wen is on high, his brightness shines in the heavens. Though Zhou is an ancient land, its mandate is renewed. Is not Zhou brilliant? Is not the mandate of Di, the god on high, not timely? King Wen ascends and descends to the left and right of Di. Obviously, again, a very politically oriented poem, a poem very easily situated within history. And the Mao preface, as it interprets this particular poem, very straightforwardly will say, King Wen represents King Wen receiving the mandate and founding Zhou. And in this case, it's hard to imagine any other real interpretation, right? But if we go back to Guan Cry the Ospreys, one more time, that poem at the beginning of the collection, we'll see that how the tradition interprets the poem is very much not what you might expect. So Guan Cry the Ospreys is the virtue of the queen consort and the beginning of the heirs. It is the means by which all under heaven, by which the whole world, is influenced and matrimony made correct. Therefore, it was used with village men and with states and kingdoms. And then it explains that wind moves things the way teaching changes people. And so this is the main commentary, but there's a commentary to the commentary, and there's also a commentary to the commentary to the commentary. And when you get into those things, they explain more clearly what's going on here. And they explain that what that poem is about, that first poem that we looked at, it's really about the queen consort, about the empress, going out into the country and finding a concubine for her husband. And she's really good at it. She's really good at finding a woman who will be just right for her husband, who has just the right qualities. But she, while she's searching for the right woman, is anxious and restless, and she can't sleep because she's worried about finding the right man, or the right woman rather, for her husband to have as a concubine. Right? And you'll notice there's very little to warrant that interpretation within the poem itself in any explicit way. There's nothing about a third person. There's a person who's restless and can't sleep, tosses and turns. That person could be male or female, actually. There's no indication in the Chinese. It's clear that the person being pursued is female. But the gender of the pursuer is not clear, and that's part of what allows the tradition to interpret this as actually really being about the empress looking for a concubine for her husband. But there's no sort of sense of there being three people involved in the poem or the searching being for a third party. And yet, because it's the first poem in the collection, it invites this sense that it must be a celebration of the good days at the beginning of the dynasty. That's the only way the tradition can make sense of the poem, and the only way it can turn that poem, which seemed to be just about love, into something with a stronger political message. Right, so it has to in some way celebrate the virtues of the early Zhou dynasty. It does so by being about the concubine. Some of the poems in the collection, this is number 8, don't give the interpreter much to work with. Right? So I think you don't need to know Chinese at all to look at the Chinese text of this poem here and see that a few things stand out. It's in couplets. The first line of each couplet is exactly the same. It's the same thing repeated, just copy, paste. The second line of each stanza is the same except for the third character, which is basically a different verb each time. So we have, 6 couplets in this poem, and each couplet is different only by one word. And then you look at the content, and it really doesn't seem to be about much, right? Picking the plantain quickly, we pick it. Picking the plantain quickly, we have it. Picking the plantain quickly, we collect it, and so on. Again, I think if you just saw that poem and were asked to guess what it's about, well, what would you guess it was about? Anyone have any thoughts? Picking plantain, sure, yeah. It sounds exactly like the kind of thing maybe that people would sing as they did this work, right? And we know around the world there are lots of traditions like that of people singing some particular song as they do some kind of physical labor, right? That's a very common phenomenon all around the world. And so maybe, yeah, that's all that's going on here. But then that's not a political reading, right? That doesn't help us understand the poem as Confucius would have wanted us to see it. And so, because it's early in the collection, because it's in a section of poems that are supposed to be orthodox, it gets interpreted, it must be praise of someone. It's praise of the queen, as it turns out. All was peaceful, and so the women of the realm rejoiced to have children. The connection between the plantain and the children thing may be a little bit less clear, but it seems to have been an herb that was used in Chinese medicine for reasons relating to childbirth. So that would be a little clue in the content of the poem that would help it make sense to its original audience. And so you put that together, it's a poem that's about an herb used in pregnancy. It has to be in praise of someone. So, it's in praise of the queen. The queen has set up a society where everyone's happy, where things are well governed, well regulated, and so women are happy to be having children. They know their children will be safe. They know there'll be a good world for their children to grow up in, and then they know they'll be safe through their pregnancies, for that matter. And so it becomes praise of all of these things. But you'll see, the text of the poem doesn't give you a lot to work with that way. It is a pretty basic poem. Or here's one. The male pheasant begins to fly, sluggishly moving his wings. The man of my heart has caused the separation. The male pheasant begins to fly. From high and low come his voice. Alas, this gentleman truly wearies my heart. Gaze upon the sun and moon, long, long do I ponder. They say the road is long, how then will he be able to come to me? You 100 gentlemen, know ye not his virtuous conduct? He angers not, nor does he demand. How could he do anything wrong? So again, I'm not showing you the answer key this time, just the poem itself. What would you think of this poem as being about, just out of context?
Sounds like the voice of a woman whose man is away.
Yeah, a woman whose man is away, or maybe they haven't quite got together yet and she longs for him, but they're not yet in a relationship or something. Yeah, it's something about a woman who is, estranged or separated from a man that she seems to admire, that she seems to think highly of. Here's what the poem is actually about, according to the commentarial tradition. I stress it's probably not what the poem is really about, but it's what the tradition thought it was. The male pheasant critiques Duke Shan of Wei, who reigned from 717 to 699 BC. Depraved and chaotic, he ignored affairs of state and several times began military expeditions. Great officials grew weary at their posts, and men and women resented being alone. The people suffering these things made this song. So again, it's the position of the poem within the collection that allows us to see it's supposed to be a poem of critique of its time. It's in the collection dealing with the state of Wei. So it's a critique of someone in the state of Wei, and it's ordered within the collection allows us to guess who it might be a critique of, right? Because there are only so many Dukes of Wei between when it's founded and when the book kind of dribbles off. And so that allows us to kind of figure out, maybe it's of Duke Shan. He wasn't very good, right? He was a bad ruler. So we'll figure out some way to make that previous poem be about that. And you see, for example, there's sort of language of, know ye not his virtuous conduct, will he be able to come to me? All of these things get turned from being a romantic set of feelings that a woman has, perhaps about a man she misses, into feelings that great officials have about not being used properly in their offices, which will become a major theme of Chinese poetry in a very direct way later on. Most poetry is written by elite men who are also seeking official careers in the civil service. Many of them don't get those careers or don't have the careers they would like, or they get fired from the civil service because of other kinds of politics, and they write tons and tons of poetry where they complain about their situation, often putting themselves in the voice of a woman abandoned by her male lover in the process, where the male lover is kind of allegorically the emperor, and you, as his lover, are a civil servant looking for career advancement and not getting it. So the poem's kind of seen in that way. Or another very simple poem, toss me a papaya, I'll pay you back with a fine belt gem, not as a payback, but so will long be good, and then that's repeated with slight variation 3 times. Again, it kind of sounds like it might be a kind of poem kids would sing as they were doing some kind of game, skipping rope or something maybe. But it praises Duke Shan of Qi because he rescues the state of Wei at a certain point. Again, we can figure this out from the position in the collection, that this is who it should be about. Very difficult to see how all of these people are derived from the poem itself, how the connection to this specific incident is derived from the poem itself. Okay. Here's another one. On the shores of this pond, there are cattails and lotus plants. There is a beautiful person, what can I do? Awake and asleep, I accomplish nothing. Tears and snivel descend like rain. Very vividly and accurately, a lot of Chinese poetry ever afterwards, when it talks about people sobbing, describes not just their tears, but their snivel as well, their snot. And it's kind of a graphic detail that Chinese poetry likes to include, and that Western poetry, for some reason, never does. To us, it would be unpoetic to mention that. On the shores of this pond, there are cattails and orchids. There is a beautiful person, large and tall and handsome. Awake and asleep, I accomplish nothing. My innermost heart is fretful. On the shores of this pond, there are cattails and lotus blossoms. There's a beautiful person, large and tall and impressive. Awake in sleep, I accomplish nothing, tossing and turning with my face on the pillow. You see a lot of tossing and turning in these poems, right? People have a lot of trouble sleeping. And again, this seems like someone in love. Here, the gender of both the speaking subject of the poem, the lover, and the beloved, the gender of both is unclear from the original. Yeah, but we can kind of see it could work either way. But again, it gets down this is what the preface decides the poem is about. The pond shore critiques its era. It tells us the Duke Ling of Chen, his lords and ministers, were sexually depraved in his state. Men and women found delight in one another, but it made them pensive and brokenhearted. So there's a lot of sleeping around going on in this state, but it doesn't make people happy. And that's kind of just a general comment there. But if we actually go to the histories of the period and look at this guy, Duke Ling of Chen, here is the story that's told about him. Duke Ling of Chen, along with two of his ministers, all had sexual relations with this famous, beautiful woman, Xiaji. They all wore pieces of her undergarments as their own, as a joke at court. Xie Ye, a minister, reproached them, saying, when the Duke and ministers announce their licentiousness, the people have no educational influence from them. The reputation of this deed is not good, so please discard the garment, my lord. And this is what you're supposed to do as a good Confucian official, point out when your lord and master is doing the wrong thing. Right? And so, yeah, wearing your mistress's underwear in court, not the right thing to do, not ritually proper. Stop doing it, take this thing off. And so the Duke says, I am able to improve. But he told the two ministers, and they asked permission to kill Xie Ye. The Duke did not prevent them from doing so, and accordingly, Xie Ye was murdered. Right? And so that's the unfortunate denouement, as this guy correctly critiqued his Duke for this inappropriate behavior, this inappropriate display, and then he's murdered. Confucius said, presumably after this incident, because the incident is before Confucius' lifetime, where the canon of songs says, where the songs say, the people have much depravity, do not establish your own depravity. This is what Xie Ye was saying. So this is a historical anecdote that then kind of brings in Confucius's voice to kind of gloss and explain what's going on, and then Confucius himself quotes the songs. A different song from the one that's supposed to be about this incident. Then there's a kind of sequel event to the one I just read. Duke Ling of Chen, together with those same two ministers who were wearing the underwear, drank at the home of the Xia family, Xia being the family of the mistress, the shared mistress. The Duke said to Han Fu, one of the ministers, Zheng Shu, the son of Xiaji, the mistress, Zheng Shu resembles you. Han Fu replied, he also resembles your lordship. So they're kind of joking about how they can't tell which one of them is the father, right? Because this young man looks like each of them. Zheng Shu, strangely, the young man, takes these remarks amiss. As the Duke was exiting from the stable, Zheng Shu shot him with his bow and killed him. The two officers fled to Chu. And so that's sort of the consequence then of that particular incident. And so all of that story, which is obviously a kind of colorful, memorable historical story, right? You're not going to forget that one quickly. That story is then kind of linked to the poem that I cited because it's a very memorable story, right? And again, it occurs at the right place in the collection to be tied to that particular poem. But again, the poem itself doesn't really seem to be talking about the same kind of thing at all. Like when we read this anecdote, yeah, these men who are putting on their mistress's underwear and joking about how this boy looks like he could be any of their sons, they don't seem that pensive, right? They don't seem worried or upset by their love. They seem like they're just having a good time until they go off and kill people over it. But they don't seem to be having at all the mood that the poem strikes, right? And then we get another kind of episode in the histories that makes a very different, but equally non-Western, you could say, use of the poems, and this is as a language for diplomatic negotiation. Right? And so there are lots of episodes like this. I've picked one. This is one I actually write about in my first book. The Earl of Zhang met with the Duke of Lu at Fei, and he asked for peace with Jin. Don't worry too much about all the details. The Duke accomplished this for both of them. The Earl of Zhang feasted for the Duke of Lu at Fei. An official from Zhang performs the song The Wild Geese. Ji Wenze of Lu says, my humble lord does not altogether lack this quality. Wenze then performed the fourth month. Zijia performed the fourth stanza of galloping. Wenze performed the fourth stanza of gathering the thorn fern. The Earl of Zhang bowed, and the Duke of Lu bowed in reply. So these courtiers sing songs or parts of songs, and this history presents that as if that was actually a diplomatic negotiation. As if it's sort of, oh, I sang that song, you know what I meant. we'll offer you 2,000 troops as long as you also vacate this other city, and then you reply by singing a different song that's like, okay, we'll do that, but you also have to do this other thing for us later on, right? And so diplomatic negotiations are imagined as taking place through the performance of song, which implies, of course, that these songs have a very stable set of meanings. And in fact, as I show in my book, it's pretty clear that they don't, and that I can come up with at least two very compelling readings of this scene that would have opposite political implications. So it's clear that the poems themselves do not have clear, stable meanings in the historical period in which they're existing and circulating. They're very often quoted against the grain. Very often texts that quote the poems quote them deliberately, because one line or one couplet happens to be suitable in mood, even though the rest of the poem is totally inappropriate, which we sometimes do in English and used to do more often in English when more people knew more poetry. But, that sort of shows how the Chinese tradition in this period with these poems frames the meaning of the poem not by saying here's an author who wrote the poem and his story or her story helps you understand what the poem means. Rather, the poem is understood through an anecdote or a series of anecdotes about when or how the poem might have been performed. And then in that performance, the poem gains a kind of meaning. And so I argue in my book, actually, that authorship is more a function of performance than of composition for this text. And it's how poems are performed that gets circulated as the kind of mythology of what the poem means. Now, just very quickly to scan forward to later Chinese poetry to emphasize that named authors really do matter for the entire rest of the Chinese poetic tradition. It's not as though this is a pattern that continues afterwards. And this begins immediately with the next sort of body of poetry we have after the canon of songs, which would be an anthology called the Chu-ci, the Songs of the South, Songs of the State of Chu, and a poem named the Li Sao, very difficult to translate title, Parting from Sorrow or something, attributed to a man named Qu Yuan from the state of Chu, who lived, as you see, in the 4th and 3rd centuries, and was either a shaman performing ecstatic rituals of spirit journeys through the heavens and sexual union with a goddess, or he was a cabinet minister upset about being denied his preferred foreign policy and expressing his resentment to his king through the vehicle of a poem about an ecstatic spirit journey through the heavens and sexual union with a goddess. Right, we can't really decide which of those two meanings might be a sort of quote-unquote original meaning for the poem. You can see the second of those two is clearly coming from this kind of Confucian tradition, right, that makes everything into a kind of political protest. But you'll see that this poem is very clearly built around not just a specific author, but around the idea of an author. Right, so the very beginning of the poem gives us his genealogy. Like, what better way to make sure we know this is a poem by a specific person? Sign of the High Lord Gaoyang, Boyong was my father's name. When Shi pointed at the first month of the year on the day of Gengyin, I passed from the womb. So the first two lines of the poem give us his ancestry and his birthday. I'd fix it pretty tidily. My father, seeing the aspect of my nativity, took omens to give me an auspicious name, so he gives me a name. Having from birth his inward beauty, I added to it fair outward adornment. So he's not a modest guy, Chapman. I dressed in Selenea and shady angelica, and twined autumn orchids to make a garland. Swiftly I sped as in fearful pursuit, afraid time would race on and leave me behind. In the morning I gathered the angelica on the mountains, in the evening I plucked the sedges of the islets. And the poem goes on for another 300 lines. I won't give all of it to you, but just that opening, I think, makes it very clear this is a poem that is focused around the idea of a very specific individual in some specific moment, going through some specific experience of his own that is not meant to be transferable to someone else, right? And that isn't meant to just be kind of cited and performed in another context with a different meaning. And moving forward still further, just give a kind of randomly chosen poem by Du Fu, the generally acknowledged greatest poet of the Chinese tradition of the Tang Dynasty. Right? This poem has a title that's very typical of a lot of Tang poetry, in that the title gives you everything you need to know about the poem. Right? Leaving Chengdu on my way to Qingtang County, sent to the two vice governors Tao and Wang. Right? So we know where he is when he's writing the poem, we know where he's going when he's writing the poem, We know who he's writing it to, and we know that they're not present with him. Poems will often also in the title include the date, so that we can actually convert and figure out to the day, and sometimes almost to the hour, when the poem was supposed to be written. Right, so the title of the poem extremely contextualizes the poem within an individual person's life, and ties it very closely to a very specific moment. It's a nice little poem, so I just wanted to give that as well. Old, I'm forced to travel by being in a cage. Poor, I sigh that I have to struggle whether going out or staying home. With the wayfarer's feelings, I lodge in another country, but I recall us three how it was writing poems. The gray river joins around the eastern part of the city. On the western mountains, the white snow is up high. What sickness will writing cure? Yet looking back, the inspiration comes flooding. So he's kind of looking back on a past time with these friends who are, of course, in the civil service, as their titles suggest, and he's reminiscing about how they would write poetry together. But again, it's both the poem itself and its title make very clear that it's about a specific individual in a specific context, incredibly specific. And I also wanted to highlight it because all of the poetry of Du Fu, all of the thousands of poems that come to us under his name, is available now in English translation for free online, translated by my teacher, Stephen Owen. So look that up if you're interested. It's an unparalleled opportunity to gain access to one of the world's great poets, who is otherwise hard to find very much of in English. And that just gives you a sense of how the stuff I was talking about with the Shijing, with the canon of songs, isn't representative of the whole history of China. It's not as though everything will be like that. It's not as though poetry is always anonymous and always sort of adaptable to different contexts, but that's how the tradition begins in China. And now, just very briefly, a few thoughts about the Greek tradition and how we might think about things in Greek poetry slightly differently, having just read some Chinese poetry. So this is a fairly famous little chunk of Greek lyric, the opening of Pindar's Pythian 1. I put the Greek up there. This isn't a test, so I've also put up English translation. Difficult stuff to translate, as any of you who've tried will know. Old golden pharynx or lyre, rightful joint possession of Apollo and the violet-haired muses. The dance step hears you, beginning of splendors, and the bards obey your signs. Whenever strings quivering, you prepare to strike up the chorus-leading preludes, and you extinguish even the spear-pointed lightning of eternal fire. And the eagle sleeps on the scepter of Zeus, slackening his swift wings on either side, ruler of the birds of prey over whose curved head you pour dark-faced mists, a sweet lock on his eyelids. He, slumbering, ripples his fluid back, held fast by your quivering notes. Beautiful passage, very difficult to figure out what's exactly going on here in many ways, and why we're talking about some of these things. And I think that's one of the interesting things about Pindar as a poet, is that he has these moments of imagery, these moments of myth, these moments of things that seem totally unrelated to the ostensible content of the poem. This is a poem in praise of an athlete who has won a competition, but none of this is about the athlete or his family or anything directly and obviously related to athletic competition. And it invites you to think about some of the connections that the Chinese tradition makes between those images that it has, the ospreys on the banks of the river and the young man or woman or whoever in love, right? And how the tradition kind of pairs these things. And to think about that eagle sleeping on the scepter of Zeus and what it's doing in the poem. Is it fool? Is it a kind of straightforward narration where the eagle on the scepter of Zeus is like right in front of us as we're hearing the poem? Is it part of our story? Is it a metaphor for something? Is it a kind of bee? Or is it a xing, an affective image? Is it just an image that through its beauty and through its kind of wonderful evocation of this animal falling asleep, or kind of shifting around a little bit in its sleep, is that somehow evoking a mood, an affect that then helps us to get into the spirit of the rest of the song? It sort of opens up other possibilities for how to think of a passage like that. I think I'm running a little short on time, so I won't dwell here, but this is one of the most famous poems of Sappho, Sappho 31, which again is a poem that is about a female, voice of the lyric poet who is intimidated by this godlike man who seems godlike to her because he's able to stand there calmly or sit there calmly while this beautiful woman who makes the poet go all aflutter and have a kind of erotic meltdown, the man is able to stand there calmly, right? And so that makes him kind of godlike. And again, if you think about this poem after having read some of these Chinese poems and all the kind of different histories of interpretation that go into them, you can kind of imagine how this poem can be both very straightforwardly a poem describing a real scene, a real moment of hopeless love, and how you might also be able to find ways to use or think of this poem in very different ways as well, that it doesn't have to be about its kind of ostensible subject. And even more moments in Greek lyric poetry that we try to tie to biographical episodes. So there are a couple of passages in Sappho where we think they may be in some way about Sappho's brother, Charaxus. And there's this whole story that Herodotus tells us about how Charaxus goes to Egypt and he rescues this prostitute woman, Rhodopis, and then he comes back to Lesbos and Sappho makes fun of him for doing this. Right, as sisters do, right, I guess. And it's like, oh, come on, you loser, why did you do this? But our evidence for all of this is actually astonishingly weak. It became stronger a couple of years ago when we discovered that new Sappho poem, which mentions the brother's name, Charaxus, for the first time. But it doesn't actually tie the brother's name to any of this other stuff, right? And we have another passage of Sappho that mentions this name, Dorica, and then the third source will tell us that the Dorica of that poem is the same as the Rhodopis of Herodotus' story. But that's how we link all of these things together. And you'll see that that kind of connection that we make that brings all of these historical and poetic texts together to tell a story is not very different from the kinds of stuff that the Chinese tradition is doing that I was talking about before, where we're fairly clear that that's not really a reflection of what the poem itself is about. So we should maybe be cautious in drawing connections between the texts of poems and historical events that we find mentioned in other texts and how we link those two together. I think I'll stop it there for now. So thank you very much, and I'll welcome some questions. Yes?
How much does meter and form play a part in the interpretations of the Chinese poems, but also the dating of the poems?
So meter, you said?
Yeah, meter and form.
Yeah, okay, so the Shijing poems are mostly in a 4-syllable line.
Yeah.
And that some of the earliest poems, or the poems that are thought to be earliest, violate that rhythm a little bit. And the Chinese themselves use that to claim that those poems were older. There's in fact then an anecdote we get later on about how in the very earliest times, the most primitive times, people wrote poems with 1 character lines. So 1 syllable for each line of poetry. It's like, well, is that really a line of poetry now? It's only got 1 syllable in it. And then they moved to 2 syllables, then they moved to 3, and then finally we got up to 4. And you actually see similar stories in Greece about adding strings to the lyre and different things like that. So there's that. But otherwise, yeah, the meter of these early poems is this very straightforward 4-syllable line. The Chinese seemingly did not yet realize that their language was tonal in this period, either because it really wasn't yet tonal and only became so later, or because they just didn't really think of it that way. So later Chinese poetry uses tonal patterns as part of the meter, but that's not the case for this kind of early tradition.
Yes. Cool. I'm glad you brought up nursery rhymes. Have you looked into the sort of weird overinterpretation we get of English nursery rhymes, the connections to political events? I've never read that kind of scholarship, so I don't know how ridiculous we consider those connections.
Yeah,
well, similar.
Well, and I think in that case you can see things going in both directions perhaps as well, right? You can see something that's really kind of a political song about a thing that's happening in London in the 1660s or something, right? That then gradually becomes a nursery rhyme that children sing that no longer has any particular meaning for anybody, right? You know, and so things can go from the one to the other. So there's a lot of debate with the Heirs of the States part of this collection in particular. Are these really genuine folk songs, folk poetry, actually performed by ordinary people? Or are the things we have already kind of scholarly elite, you know, revisions of those kinds of songs? And people debate that endlessly. In the early 20th century, everyone in both China and the West rushed to thinking that all of this stuff was folk poetry, and it was really the songs of the people. And then everyone kind of rushed back in the other direction and said, no, we've gone too far. And it's really unclear, right? I mean, there's no way of discovering this for sure. Yes?
It's so fascinating to learn about this history of interpretation, and what it makes me think of more than anything else is the way that Homer gets endlessly over-interpreted allegorically interpreted, Odyssey 8, Ares and Aphrodite becomes a philosophical account of the creation of the universe. And it's just two gods sleeping with each other. And I was wondering, have you compared sort of the ways that Greek poetry gets interpreted by Greeks and the way that these Chinese poems are getting interpreted?
Well, to some extent. I mean, it's not an easy project in a sense because of the different ways in which interpretive traditions get transmitted in Greece and in China, right? So in China, you can't find the poems without the interpretation, right, traditionally. They're always transmitted together. And usually, in fact, you'll see the poem itself in big type, then the commentary in smaller type, and the commentary in even smaller type, and kind of all builds up there. And so it's hard to escape from that one interpretation, which was originally only one of many interpretations, but became a canonical one for kind of historical reasons. And in the Greek tradition, we never quite settled on here's the one authoritative interpretation. So there's that, and and often our knowledge of interpretive traditions of Homer are a little shaky, right? We have bits and pieces, but not a coherent reading always. And then the different nature of the text matters too, right? So Homer is this big, long, epic story. Where we kind of, if you want a surface reading of Homer, I can give you a surface reading of Homer, but it is just that about, here's this guy who's trying to get home, right? And we can tell that story. That's left open to allegory, but it's not required that you allegorize the story to make sense of it. Whereas, a poem like the one about the plantains or whatever, either it's simply like a song that people sing when they're picking plants, in which case why would Confucius have bothered to put it into his anthology, or you have to go to considerable allegorical levels of ingenuity to make any sense of it. So it'd be an interesting project to look more deeply at those different traditions, but there are some obstacles in the way of doing that, I think. Sure.
So I work in LCS a lot. He's kind of got more confined pieces like this. And I was just reading this fellow who had to defend against a bunch of people reading his ship of state poems. And it's like him literally sitting in a boat, like telling his comrades, like, take heart. But then this modern author even has trouble still dealing with, it starts talking about the tackle, and it starts, so it goes into detail, and he's like, how could this be encouraging to anybody? But the affectual idea really makes sense to me. So I was wondering if anyone's done work in things like Alcius, some of the more confined lyric poetry where they take something like that affect idea and actually apply it to maybe thinking about Greek ideas of poetry.
Yeah, or even not just sort of literally applying the Chinese poetic idea to the Greek text, but in a way also just using the existence of that Chinese idea as a way of opening up our own systems of interpretation so that we don't have to kind of have a point-by-point similarity then between the tenor and the vehicle of the simile, right? Because that is often where similes break down, right? Is at some point you realize that some detail of the image doesn't really fit very comfortably with the larger world that it's trying to describe, which, it's not surprising because they're two different things. The ship and the stage are not exactly the same thing. But yeah, no, I mean, I think there is certainly productive room to think more creatively about how to interpret poems, or how poems have been interpreted as well, if you're thinking that kind of comparative way. Sure.
And do you see that in the commentaries to the Chinese poetry? Do you see debates? Do you see alternate allegorical interpretations vying with each other?
Oh, all the time. So, people have done, in contemporary times, have gathered together the interpretive history of these poems in reference works. And you'll see, sort of to debate whether a particular poem is fu, bi, or sheng. You'll sort of see that there's this long history, and this person said it was fu, this person said it was bi, this person says it's fu and bi, and this person says it's fu and bi and sheng. And they all kind of argue about these things. Because of course it's unclear, right? I mean, sometimes it's very clear, and sometimes it's completely unclear whether, as I said with that very first stanza of the collection, and the osprey could really just be there and be a part of the scenery, or it could be allegorical, or it could be just sort of setting the mood. And there's nothing internal to the poem that forces any of those interpretations. And there's nothing about the rest of the tradition that forces any of those interpretations either. Right? So, you see tons of debate. And then tons of debate about if this is an allegory, what is an allegory? Of course.
Yeah, it's that third way that has me most fascinated, that shape, that idea of an open-ended allegory. I mean, would you say that that's a a reasonable reading of that idea of an affective image. An open-ended allegory, like some people say with Alcides, or Robert Frost is really great about this, where it's just an image that you can go in 3 different directions, and the poet is not pushing you one way. He doesn't necessarily have one in mind.
I think it's partly about that, but it's also about sort of about being affective rather than cognitive. Say, so it's also just about that idea that, oh, the cry of an osprey makes me sad. This is a sad poem, so that's nice.
Okay, affective rather than polycognitive.
Yeah, for the most part. But I mean, again, people play with these terms quite a lot in the tradition as well. I think you're okay.
Homer had a kind of authoritative status, and then along comes Plato, who keeps quoting him and then yet has an ambivalent relationship to him and wants to censor him and so on. Do these odes have that same sort of authoritative status and then get critiqued in some way by the philosophers, or are they just, do they have an authoritative status that they just keep forever?
Well, I mean, there isn't the quarrel between poetry and philosophy that Socrates claims to find in Greek. And people, of course, have done interesting work with that. So he said, Socrates says there's an ancient quarrel between poetry and philosophy, but how can it be ancient when both of these are things that were just invented the day before yesterday, basically, in the Greek world? But remember, this anthology is traditionally thought to have been edited by Confucius. So rather than being seen as in some way hostile to what philosophy is doing, it's seen as part of the program of Confucius. But you can think of the Confucian classics as a whole, as they were understood in the Han Dynasty and afterwards, as being basically a set of manuals for how to live as an elite male. So there was a music, which told you the music you were supposed to play. There was the ritual manual, which told you not just how to sacrifice to your ancestors, but also, what to serve at a dinner party, basically, and what kinds of social interactions you should have. There are the songs, which give you, things to, poems to perform, and obviously you can use them in diplomatic contexts and all sorts of contexts. There's a set of historical documents, there's a chronicle. And so the idea of the Confucian classics is that all of these things were created by Confucius as a kind of kit, right, that gives you everything you need to know about early Zhou culture to make you into a civilized, educated, elite male. And that all of these things have been edited by Confucius so that they're perfect for that purpose. So when you do get critique, it's more coming from other directions in a certain sense. I mean, a lot of the poetic influence of the canon of songs isn't always that great. Later poets only evoke the canon of songs in certain moods. They evoke Chu and his shamanic journey through the heavens much more frequently. Shijing poems kind of come up more when you want to show your learning. And people, so they have a different kind of relationship to the poetic tradition. And much of later Chinese poetry is kind of about an interest in withdrawal from the world and withdrawal from the political sphere and their Confucian obligations to be a minister and so on. And as a result, in a way, the opposition comes more perhaps from within the literary tradition than from the philosophical tradition. Then you get someone like Zhu Xi, the Neo-Confucian philosopher. He comes up with a new set of interpretations for many of these poems, actually simplifying the interpretation, saying, this is just a love song. In many cases where the tradition had developed this very elaborate theory.
That last thing you said just threw a switch in my head. The idea of a sort of pastoral picture and withdrawing from society and so on sounds a lot more Taoist than Confucian, but they're generally thought to be in tension with each other. But the Taoists don't use the Xi Jing in their, they don't quote it.
Well, and that's where a lot of poets don't either, in the sense where they draw that heavily on the imagery. There are individual images, for example, that do get drawn regularly from the Xi Jing in poetry. Like there's a famous poem that I almost included in my presentation, but I had too many poems already, where a woman's beauty is described in a series of similes, and one of those similes is that her eyebrows are like moth antennae, which to a European language-trained audience sounds grotesque, and in Chinese it sounds, even today, sounds totally ordinary. Like, of course women's eyebrows look like moth antennae, right? They're arched, they're thin, they're delicate. And and that's an image that gets conveyed. So you just have to mention moth antennae, and everyone automatically thinks women's eyebrows, right? But the kind of overall poetics of the Xi Jing are in a way not very influential on the poetic tradition. And in some ways, as I say, it's sort of the opposition between Confucianism and Taoism in a certain sense that is often found within individual, not just within the society. Like you're not sort of taking a stand as one or the other, but both can be part of your life in different ways. You and
Yeah, so is the main comparative lesson you're drawing an interpretive one where, I was trying to think like I got your point right, where what appear to be, let's say, romantic poems are really referring to some historical fact in the Chinese poetry, and so you want to see if the same can be done for Greek poetry? Is that the idea?
Or maybe it's a kind of skepticism, I think is probably more what my theme is, that it's easy for us from the outside to look at the poem, in the Chinese case, look at the poem and then to look at the official interpretation and say, hey, this interpretation is silly, right? This is imposed artificially on the poem. But my hope is that in a way, by thinking about the artificiality of the orthodox Confucian interpretation of the Chinese poem, that helps us to think in slightly different ways about Greek poetry, for example, or just European poetry in general, and think about how, in fact, a lot of conventions govern the way we interpret poems too, just a very different set of conventions. And I only kind of gesture towards that a little bit at the end, but I think that's sort of the take-home lesson if your work actually focuses on the European tradition, right? Is, well, how can we try to look for the invisible barriers to interpretation that a tradition of several thousand years has thrown up in our way? Which then begins to suggest that I think there is a sort of straightforward, here's the original meaning of the poem, which I wouldn't want to suggest either, but you can decide there is no clear original meaning of the poem, and also the 2,000 years of tradition have obscured things about the poem as well. I think both can be true. At the back.
Hi, thanks. I really enjoyed the talk. And the pairing of the Confucian sort of collection that creates a kind of meaning, obviously, could call into question the whole idea of authorship of the Greek tradition, right? And I wonder if you have that sort of Foucauldian idea in mind, or maybe Martian, if we want to go back. But I mean, would you deconstruct the notion of authorship in, especially, say, the Archaic period?
Well, I mean, I think what I'm trying to do in the book that I have on this, and see the book if you want to sort of read more on what I have to say, is that, I mean, ideas of authorship of some kind clearly exist to at least some extent in the Archaic Greek world, and especially in the classical Hellenistic world. And we have all sorts of biographies and stories about poets. And one of my arguments is, traditionally people have read those things and said, oh, they're just not true, right? They're made up, they're fiction, they're the biographical fallacy. They're taking events from someone's poetry and then creating a biography that fits those events in the poetry. And one of the things I try to show, first of all, is like, for example, with Homer, you can't do that. Homeric epic doesn't give you that much to go on in terms of what its author's life might be like. And most of the detail in the lives of Homer has to come from somewhere other than Homeric epic. There are a few things that do come from the epics. And then, I think, when you actually look at it, what's really going on in a lot of the Greek tradition of authors' biographies, poetic lives in the ancient world, is that these are a way of thinking about text, right? And so you tell stories about an author as a way of kind of encoding your theory about the text, or they do encode your theory about the text, even if you're not aware that you have one. And so one of the examples I use here is the blindness of Homer, right? And so people debate whether Homer is blind in the Greek world. They don't insist, everyone doesn't insist that he's blind. Some people think he is. Some scoff at the idea. But if you read the lives of Homer closely, the people who argue that he's blind also are pretty clear that he's not using writing to create his poems. Because very often they will in fact say he's struck blind and then he creates his poems. They're very clear about that. And I don't see how in the ancient Greek world you can be struck blind and then write poetry, using the technology of writing, which was hard enough for anyone to use in that time, let alone if you're blind. So the idea is pretty implicitly, if not explicitly, then you have an oral poet, not a written one. The people who object to the idea that Homer is blind are explicitly often saying, but he wrote his poetry, and kind of drawing a connection there. So that talking about Homer's blindness actually becomes a way of talking about whether this is oral poetry or not. Or even if you're not explicitly intending to do so, you're showing your hand in that particular game. And so to kind of return to Foucault, yeah, I mean, it's a kind of sense that this is what the author function is for this period in Greece. These are the kinds of questions it's there to talk about. Did you have a follow-up?
No,
Oh, sorry.
it's comfortably said.
Sure.
So have you looked at maybe like the Archaea in connection with sort of collection? Because that seems more like an appropriate interface between the Greek and Chinese tradition. Is that something you've explored? Or?
I haven't really directly, but yeah, that would be a very interesting thing to look at that way, just to think about how that particular body of text gets associated with an author in ways that it can't entirely be true at every moment. And so on, right? So yeah.
So coming back to actually the four-syllable stanzas, the four-character stanzas, it brings back memory to several of your old memories of plot. I remember that there is a certain proverbial form, I think, that is always done in four characters. Do you know if there's any sort of relation between the four-character stanza and the four-character proverbs?
Yeah, well, not just proverb, but in Chinese we'd say chengyu, these kind of set expressions that people use all the time. And those are often four-character phrases or a couplet of two four-character phrases. Part of this is just that as time goes on, that's what prose is. So, you can say at a certain period in Chinese literary history, prose occurs in couplets of 4 or 6 syllables each. Poetry occurs in couplets of 5 or 7. Yeah, which is a different understanding of poetry in prose than we have in English, for example. But that idea that in a way prose is in these evenly matched sets is kind of deeply rooted in Chinese literature, and that's where a lot of these Chinese expressions come from. And it probably does have to do with Shijing on some level. Poetry in China does, actually drawing more on Shu Ci than on Shijing, does develop these 5 and 7 syllable lines, which give you more you can do, right? I mean, even 7 syllables, which is basically 7 words, is not that much to put into a line of poetry, but you can do more with 7 syllables than you can with 4. So if you've got a 4-syllable line, it kind of restricts how complex your ideas can get. You're not going to get that eagle sleeping on the scepter of Zeus in a 4-syllable line.
I'm glad you asked that question because I also had a question about the 4-syllable line. So you said it's very nursery rhyme-like. Do you mean that it's rhymed?
It is rhymed, yeah.
So this early poetry is already rhymed?
Yeah.
Okay.
And in fact, that's some of the best evidence we have for early Chinese phonology, is the presumption that these poems do rhyme in the original time period. A lot of them still rhyme.
Mm-hmm.
That seems likely they kind of always have. Sometimes they don't rhyme anymore, but that helps us to sort of uncover the original phonology, which of course has shifted staggeringly from 800 BC to the present, especially without a phonetic writing system.
Do they alliterate as well?
Sorry?
Do they have alliteration as well?
To some extent, yeah.
Okay.
Not as a formal feature, but
Okay.
it can certainly happen.
Interesting.
And again, that can be trickier to deduce because some of that might have been there in the original pronunciation and is lost today,
Mm-hmm.
or be found today but not be present in the original. And that's sort of one of the problems, because the pronunciation has changed
Right.
so dramatically.
Any more questions? Great talk. Thank you so much.